Lacan is increasingly drawn to knots in the mid-1970s. You may have heard this, right? Everybody's heard this. Everybody knows this. Some people make a big deal about this draw to knots. If the first part of Lacan's teaching is tropological, they'll often claim, the second, which leads us here to the mid-1970s, is topological, they'll continue. These folks aren't wrong, but I would say that they're a bit off the mark, so to speak. More than knots, Lacan was interested in their drawings, their diagrams. It was diagrams of knots that fascinated him and drove his late teaching. More than three-dimensional rings of string, he was interested in drawings of three-dimensional rings of string, inviting audiences to imagine them in and through flattened, planar, two-dimensional geometric shapes. Now, in the last lecture of this series on Seminar 23, the Synthome, we talked about spheres. In the specular image of one's own body, Lacan says we typically see a sphere. But it's not the sphere as such that interests our boy at this point. Instead, what interests Lacan is the requisite image for any illusion of a sphere, namely the circle. It's the geometric shape of the circle that allows us to imagine the topological surface of a sphere. This is how Lacan is thinking. And I want you to note the move he's making here. If the analysand imagines a sphere where a circle appears, the analyst sees a ring with interior and exterior voids alike. In particular, they see a torus. So on your screen right now is a blackboard, digital blackboard, of course, and we can just draw one of these things I'm calling a circle. It won't be perfect, but it will be adequate. There you have it. There is a blue ring, a blue circle on your screen. You can imagine it as a sphere. Usually you just add a little curvature at the top, a little hook of sorts, the worm of a reflection that gives it that bubular spherical shape. But really, fundamentally, what you have here is an image of a ring, the name for which is circle. Notice this. The analysand looks at this mirror image, so to speak, and sees a sphere. The analyst, however, sees a ring with an interior and an exterior beyond. An interior void, that's the inside of the circle, connected to the exterior beyond. You can tell they're connected because they're the exact same color. Let that be our reminder. Black in the middle, black beyond. Both the analyst and the analysand are dupes, but one of them is better off than the other. For where the analysand counts only one, indeed a one all alone, a singular autonomous sphere, the analyst, I'm telling you, counts three. A circular shape with a hole inside connected to an exterior domain beyond. An interior void that can and must be located, and a location which is oddly enough continuous with the open space beyond the circle that establishes that inner realm. An exterior space beyond the limits of which we know not. And all, mind you, from what remains little more than the planar drawing we call circle. What intrigues Lacan about circles is not just their inner voids and exterior domains, holes, if you will, and their beyonds. In fact, that'd be a great title for this lecture, Holes and Their Beyonds. But that's not exactly what intrigues him. In fact, what intrigues him is the principle of this circle that allows it to be linked. Because it has a hole in it, an inner void, it can be linked or knotted to other circles. This is what intrigues him about the circle. Again, let's quote from his 1975 talk at MIT. This one comes to us just beneath the passage that we read last time in our first lecture of this series. We must apprehend something of another order than spherical space. So you'll recall in the passage that we read in our first lecture from this MIT talk, Lacan says there is a theory of psychoanalysis. It's got two principles, the first principle of which is the body, not what it means to be a body, but instead what it means to have one. To be a body is a question of the real. To have a body, he says, is a question for the imaginary, because we have bodies at the level of their specular images, their forms, their appearances, their apparent unities, their appearing, their seeming, all the stuff we've been talking about. This is where he starts. And he says that first and foremost, the specular image of one's own body appears to us as a sphere. And from there, of course, he gets into the harmony of the spheres and Greek thought. It's a wild spin out from our last lecture. The passage we're reading now is just beneath that. And what Lacan starts by saying is, we must apprehend something of another order than spherical space. So now we're getting to what it means to do Lacanian theory. We are starting with an order other than spherical space. It is not clear that the image of the circumference is the best representation of a sphere. And this is how I've been led to break new ground, namely that the circle is not the correct image of a sphere. It is the image of a sphere when it is sectioned, that is, when it is flattened out. This sheet of paper upon which we draw is quite tangible. We can do no better than to lay it out flat. As we make our way in the world, this flattening out tends to unravel, as if this surface on which we project everything that surrounds us has holes in it. And it is characteristic of a circle to make a hole. Counterblow. The mathematical idea of topology. There are not only circles in the world, but knots can be made from these circles. This is how topology began. It is by virtue of these knots that I have been able to make a link with what is involved in our experience. Now, once more, notice how his thought unfurls. He begins by simply saying, what can we do other than spherical thinking? Well, we can talk about the sphere as it is flattened and segmented into circles. And then from there, he's on to paper, he's on to holes, and with holes come knots. He is moving very fast at this point. Some of this is review from work that he's been doing in the recent 1974, first part of 1975. So La Troisième and Seminar 22. But the speed and rapidity with which he's moving from sphere to circle to hole, which allows for links and knots, tells you that he is angling towards something. Let's think about this. From spheres to circles to holes to knots, what the hell is he doing? What indeed is he angling toward here? I think Lacan is trying to tell folks, at MIT in this case, how the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real intersect, or more precisely, how they are interwoven. Until, of course, they're not, which is part of how we arrive at the synthome, about which more later. In the meantime, let's continue with this talk he gives at MIT. These knots, he says, if there is a closed, circular, and representable consistency of these three terms that I have advanced on the basis of Freud. And now he's going to tell you what these three terms are that he says he's advanced on the basis of Freud. The capture based on the form of the body. There's your imaginary. The striking use of speech, whatever the idea one might have of what conditions in humans the fact of speaking. There is another consistency. The word for it is symbolic. We have to realize that what we call logic has no other support than the logos, which is the Greek word for discourse. Strangely, we are so poor at realizing, so little aware that this logic is circular. It only holds together, it is only substantiated by becoming a circle. The vicious circle is the ABC of logic. From the moment we commence with language, it is to language that we return. Here again, he is referring to the symbolic. Next move. How, Lacan asks, on that basis, do we imagine that we touch on a real that would be a third circle, as it were, whether its form would be the circular is what escapes us. Now, he gives us the real, this third consistency, he says. There is no other possible definition of the real than this. It is the impossible. The real is only there where something is encountered, characterized as impossible. When one bumps into something, the real is the impossible to penetrate. We have dreamed that it would be elastic. It is this that led me to write the term existence in another way, EX-sistence. What bumps into something and what something bumps into are precisely the other consistencies. These three terms, here Lacan is summing up his three registers. Those that we imagine as a form, here's the imaginary. Those that we imagine as circular in language, here is the symbolic. And this X-sistence, both to the imaginary and to language, have led me to highlight that by which they are knotted together. So right now, on your screen, you see one circle. Lacan here is discussing three. These for him are the three dimensions of speaking being. And he says that they are linked, that they are knotted together. Technically, they are linked in his thought. But the word he's using here is not. He corrects it a little later in Seminar 23. But for now, just note, we've only drawn one of these rings so far. The knot in question, the one that's not really a knot but more of a link, it's actually, if we were going to push it, a braid. In fact, if we're going to be precise, it's a Brownian link. Let's draw it together. Let's draw these three registers as they link together, as they knot together, as Lacan is here describing them. I think it's important that we go through this exercise, really more of a ritual, in order to recall once more how he draws his thought. We start, first and foremost, with the imaginary. And in fact, if we want to play this out, what we can do is we can write in the imaginary, very quickly summing up what it is we said in our last lecture. This blue ring on your screen that appears whole, consistent, unbroken, and one is the imaginary. And in it, I follow Lacan in writing the word corps, meaning body. Again, this is what it means to have an image of one's own body. It's a single circle, which gives us an image of oneness. The word for this is consistence. This blue circle on your screen seems to consist. It hangs together. It seems to be singular, united, unbroken, and one. Its modality is consistence, according to Lacan. The next he discusses is the symbolic. And I'm going to draw it in such a way that allows us to tell a slightly different story. I will draw it with 2 strokes of the pen. Here we have the symbolic. And I don't know if you've been able to guess at this point what Lacan writes in it. If you tuned into our last couple of lecture series, you know. The symbolic for Lacan is fundamentally a field of death. It is a killing field. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Body in the imaginary, death in the symbolic. And I draw them in such a way that it looks like, it appears as though the symbolic ring is underneath the blue ring of the imaginary. Do you see how I drew that? By making 2 strokes of the pen for the symbolic, I've allowed it to appear as though it is an unbroken ring underneath the imaginary. Because it's underneath another unbroken ring, we can't see the full ring. All we can see are the 2 parts of it. This is crucial for Lacan. What he is inviting folks to do at this point is to allow themselves to enter in to this optical illusion. This is what it means to be a good dupe for him. A good dupe allows themselves to be fooled by this drawing that I'm working up for you, allows themselves to see it 3-dimensionally for thought's purpose, not as spheres, but as interlocking rings. It's pretty crucial. And I think it's illustrative here that the symbolic shows up for us in this drawing, not with a count of 1, but with a count as 2. The imaginary arrives in this drawing with a single stroke of the pen that gave us the unbroken blue circle. In the imaginary, we count 1. But in the symbolic, you can see me already working in that direction if you're watching the video, we count 2. The symbolic deciphers the singular cipherings of the imaginary into differential fields. So I think it works well. It's kind of a nice touch that the symbolic appears in this drawing first in 2. I told you also that the symbolic is a field of death, that it's a killing field. Indeed, it's not me. Lacan is the one who writes death in the symbolic. You can see it in some of his earlier stuff from a year or so ago. La Troisième is a really good example of this. Again, check out our lectures on that if you want a review on all this stuff. The death he's talking about, I told you it's metaphorical. It's closely connected to what he's doing with the symbolic as a place that makes a whole. The symbolic for him has one basic function more than any of the others. It is to make a whole. Signifiers blast holes in stuff, he thinks. The word for this that we cooked up in our last series on Seminar 22 is absistence. Now, he thinks of it as making a whole. The word we're going to use technically for it is absistence. So if you've got ears and eyes to see what's happening here, the imaginary is a field of consistence, where things hang together. The symbolic, however, is a field of absistence, where things do not hang together except in differential relation to other things. We'll come back to this term absistence, because for some of you who weren't with us in the last series, it's kind of a weird one. The etymology can help you do all the work. In fact, that's how I arrived at the term absistence, was by working the etymology. You can do the same and get the basic insights, but I'll rehearse it again here in a minute. So just hang tight, because we need to draw a third ring. The third ring in all of this, for Lacan, is the ring that we label real. And the way that Lacan draws it is really crucial here. The real is going to cut in to the imaginary. It's going to break that consistency, that circle, that apparent singular stroke into two. The real is going to overlay the imaginary, but undergird the symbolic. So previously, we had an imaginary ring sitting atop a symbolic ring. Now, if you just take one in one hand and the other in the other hand, and you pull them apart, you're going to have an imaginary ring in your left hand and a symbolic ring in the other. They are not yet linked. One is just simply laying atop the other. The third ring that Lacan offers, that he labels real, is the one that links the imaginary and the symbolic together, which is why I draw it like this. The ring of the real passes over the imaginary, but under the symbolic. Now take a look at what you have here. Now you have three rings linked together. Now, take a look, use your imagination. Lacan's really insistent on this. You need to have an active imagination to follow his thought at this point. Being a good dupe is just that. Now, how do we label this register of the real? I gave you a clue last time. And if you've been through our recent series, you already know what I'm going to write here. The real for Lacan is the field of life. By life here, I mean being a body. In the imaginary, we have a body at the level of its image. In the real, however, we are bodies. The real corporal lived experience of being a body. Winced, stubbed, wrinkled, crickling, and crackling, you've heard me say. Lacan writes life in the real. We know nothing of this. Whether we're talking about trees, plants, oysters, or ourselves, life is a field existent to knowledge. It butts in, it cuts in, and establishes a link between the imaginary and the symbolic. We'll talk about that. The word here, though, that I want to have on our screen is another one of those sistences, written just the way that Lacan writes it here. EX hyphen sistence. Existence for Lacan means outside standing. It sits outside. Well, what exactly does the real exist? It sits beyond these other two registers, into which it nevertheless cuts. with the addition of this third ring. In an admittedly sloppy but precisely correct Borromean knot, we now see the basic consistencies with which Lacan is working throughout Seminar 22 and again here at the start of Seminar 23. Consistence in the imaginary, where the primary illustration is the specular image of one's own body. Absistence in the symbolic, the basic function of which is to make a whole, not unlike the one you dig for that dog that recently passed. Hence, death, perhaps. And existence for the real, the primary illustration of which is raw and wriggling biological life, which is oftentimes stubbed, winced, wrinkled, you get the idea, bumping into stuff. Here we have the three dimensions of speaking being as Lacan understands them. Having a body equals imaginary consistence. Being a body is a matter of real existence. And then we come to this third, symbolic absistence. What might that mean? In this lecture, I would like to venture this. If having a body is what occurs in the imaginary, and being a body is what occurs in the real, I would like to suggest that thinking a body is what occurs in the field of the symbolic, by way of absistence, by way of hole making, grave digging, tombstone etching. You can just trot it out from there, I'm sure. Admittedly, this is a lot to wrap our heads around, our feet as well. For many of you, though, who attended our recent series, maybe not so much. You've heard all of this from me before. Consistence, absistence, existence. To say nothing, I haven't even mentioned the fourth term from our last lecture series, inexistence. These were the conceptual bedrocks of our work there. And I'm pushing on them here because they are still top of mind for Lacan, or perhaps bottom of foot, at the start of Seminar 23. And with that, we crack the book. Meet me on page 37 of the standard English translation of Seminar 23, the Synthome. Not coincidentally, the same pages where we see a very clean and tidy looking, although drawn differently, Borromean knot. Start at the bottom of page 37, and we'll work the top of page 38 for this illustration. Notice once more how these three terms, consistence, absistence, and existence, are coursing through Lacan's thought. And remember, absistence is my term. I just use it to give some consistence to Lacan's terminology. To absist is to make a whole. The three circles of the Borromean knot, Lacan says, they are as circles equivalent to each other. They are constituted by something that is reproduced in all three of them. Whatever happens, don't lose sight of this fact. It is not by chance. Indeed, it is the result of a certain concentration that I place in the imaginary the support of what makes for consistency. What is the support in the imaginary that makes for consistency? The body, the image of the body. I likewise make the whole the essential part of what is involved in the symbolic. And I give special import, special support to the real in what I have been calling X-sistence. The fact that the first two, he's talking about the imaginary and the symbolic rings, are loose from one another This is the very definition of the Borromean knot. Enable me to sustain the existence of the third, that of the real, in relation to the free-roaming imaginary and symbolic. Insisting outside the imaginary and the symbolic, the real butts into, plays into, something that is of the order of limitation. Once it has been tied to the other two in Borromean fashion, from that moment forth, the two others resist it. This is a way of saying that the real only enjoys existence to the extent that it encounters, with the symbolic and the imaginary, a point of arrest. Notice, once more, what Lacan is telling us about the so-called Borromean knot, a telling well displayed, I would suggest, in our drawing of it. The imaginary ring apparently consists as one, even a one all alone as we first drew it, an unbroken, consistent circle to start. But there is also the ring of the symbolic, here drawn beneath, positioned beneath that of the imaginary as we drew it, as a circle that appears composed of two parts, two strokes of the pen. Quite literally, it's just two strokes of the pen that provides the illusion of it being underneath the imaginary. But with these two strokes, we have a differential relation of marks, if you catch my drift. Where the imaginary invites us to count one, the symbolic, once more, appears to us in two. Without a third ring to link the imaginary and the symbolic, however, they remain loose from one another, as Lacan puts it, free roaming even, into which the real, he says, butts. This time, butts spelled with two T's. The real passes over the imaginary and thus divides it into two. Take a look at the diagram on your screen. How many blue strokes of the pen do you see now? Not one, but two to constitute the so-called ring of the imaginary. The real passes over the imaginary, breaking it into two, but under the symbolic, thereby leaving it in two, thus limiting both rings' abilities to fall apart, limiting both circles' capacity to go astray. This emphasis on limitation is key. When the real butts in, it's as a limitation, a constraint, a tie, indeed, a knot. A knot which, from that moment forth, Lacan says, the two others resist. What a terrific way to understand the imaginary and the symbolic relative to the limitation imposed on them by the real. Both imaginary and the symbolic are constantly resisting arrest. I think it's clear here why the function of the imaginary is consistence. I think you get that. At the level of the image, everything just seems fixed, fastened, hung together. Something of the one, to be sure. Here is the circle in its simplest form. You can get your sheet of paper and draw it just the way I did. And I think it's clear why the function of the real is existence, spelled with a hyphen between the X and the sistence, because it stands outside of the other two, even and especially as it butts in. We'll come to that later. The real is, in other words, what stands apart from the imaginary, the symbolic, and their intersectional offspring, namely meaning. Now, we made a lot about this in recent series, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it here, but I will just flag it because Lacan does mention it some at the start of Seminar 23. Between the imaginary and the symbolic, in this intersectional zone I'm marking with a yellow dot, Lacan writes sens, which is a tricky French word, but in this case quite simple. It just means meaning. Meaning is what's produced at the intersection of imaginary and symbolic. Think of this. Meaning is the offspring of parent imaginary and parent symbolic. When those two get together and share a space, meaning is what is produced. Meaning, in other words, is half imaginary and half symbolic, if you want to think of it that way. Relative to each, the imaginary and the symbolic, but especially to their offspring meaning, the real is truly outstanding, ecstatic, or as Lacan puts it here, existent. Now, for some of you who are listening to this lecture, it's going to be tricky to see what I mean. But if you are watching the YouTube video of this lecture, look at the diagram on your screen. Where is sens, meaning, placed relative to the real? Is it inside or outside of the red ring we label real? It is outside. And we can say the same about the real relative to meaning. The real exists meaning. It is beyond meaning. It sits outside of meaning. It's a great way to think about this. Meaning exists the real, but the opposite is also true. That's the point Lacan is making here about existence. Here is the exterior domain beyond any given circle. If absistence names the whole in any given circle, consistence names the circle image, and existence names what is beyond that circle. So were I to draw it on your screen, just to add a fourth ring, there's never anything wrong with adding a fourth ring, is there? I'm not going to connect them. I'm going to draw it down here, again, just as a simple circle. What I'm trying to say here is that in the circle, this inner void, this hole, we write ab. Beyond the circle, outside it, here is our field of existence. I label it X. And the circle itself, the ring that allows for an inner and exterior domain, we label consistence. So I hope with this additional drawing you can see what's going on here. Yes, consistence is the proper function of the imaginary. Yes, absistence is the proper function of the symbolic. It blows holes and stuff. And the real absolutely is a field of existence beyond them both. However, each ring on your screen has all three elements going at once. There's a very real sense, so to speak, that the body is a whole in the imaginary. Death is a whole in the symbolic, and life is a whole in the real. Each of these rings has an inner void, an absistent center. Imaginary, symbolic, and real alike all have a hole in the middle. They all also have existences, things, fields that are beyond them. We just talked about how meaning exists the real. It stands outside the red ring. It is outside, beyond the red ring. That's all Lacan means by existence. It's something that stands outside another consistency, but nevertheless allows itself to insist there, butting in. That's the odd element in existence, which is why we oftentimes use the word extimacy instead, because it captures the intimate butting in that the real so often does, but also the exterior position from which it butts in. You see, a hole is always a hole in something. Existence always comes from without. It butts in from without. It begins outside and cuts in, if you want to think of it in that kind of chronological way. This doesn't carry us too far afield. In fact, this puts us right on point. Every one of the rings on your screen is comprised of consistence, absistence, and existence. As soon as you draw a circle on a page, on a wall, on a blackboard, you have these three sistencies popping: the consistency of the circle itself, the absistence or the hole within it, and then the exterior domain that is continuous with that hole. We call it existence. I think Lacan is all over this. I think this is one of the main things that he's working out in the mid-1970s. I think it comes to a head in Seminar 22, and he's building on it here at the start of Seminar 23. He is just all over this, as we've seen in previous lectures, and as he suggests at the start of Seminar 23. So I'm not going to say too much about it, except simply to point you to what I think is a key passage at the start of our seminar on the synthome, where you can see Lacan running this argument in a way that I think is pretty productive. It's on page 50, and it extends to page 51. You don't have to have the book. As ever, I've got mine here, and I'll read it for you. It captures some of what's happening here with existence being outside of whatever ring that we draw. And he wants to call this real. The reason why I think it's worth dwelling on here, we get the imaginary as a field of consistency. Our last lecture was dedicated to talking about that. I want to see if we can just lock down the real as a field of existence so that we can then shift to talking about the symbolic as a place where wholes are made. Let's see what we can do here. Bottom of page 50. All of this implies, Lacan says, a notion of the real. Of course, we have to make it distinct from the symbolic and the imaginary. The only onerous factor, this really is the fitting expression, and you'll be seeing it later. You'll be seeing why later, is that in this affair, the real makes sense, when in actual fact, if you look more deeply into what I mean by this notion of the real, it appears that the real is grounded in that it bears no meaning, that it excludes meaning, or more accurately, in that it settles in a deposit on account of being excluded from meaning. I'm telling you this as I think it, so that you should know this. I'm telling you. So here what Lacan is describing is what brought me to change my pen color to yellow, so that you can see that meaning, sens, is exterior to the real. This is what it means when we say the real is whatever is meaningless, without meaning. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute. You don't have a symbol or an image for the real when you brush up against it. Your first experience is, what the fuck was that? You don't know. Again, the real is existent to enunciated knowledge. You don't know that. You don't know what that was. This is another way of getting at the issue by way of meaning. The field of enunciated knowledge is the field of language. Language is characterized for Lacan by meanings. Meanings being made, unmade, refashioned, and the like. We write that sens, S-E-N-S, which is the French word for meaning. And Lacan positions it very precisely beyond the real, and the real beyond meaning. This is a great passage to hold in mind. Put a bookmark in page 50 to 51. Return to this often whenever the real comes up in this seminar or in this series on this seminar. It's truly good stuff. Now, if you sensed that I was moving a little bit fast through that, you are correct. Because like I said, I'm itching to get to the symbolic. We've talked a lot about the imaginary. You just heard me rattle on about the real. I want to tell you a little more about the symbolic because I think this one is really the trickiest of the three. Isn't that weird? You'd think the imaginary would be the easiest. Lacan jokes in some earlier works of his that you all think the imaginary is just a fool, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. That's why le non-duper, Seminar 21, the non-duped-er, that's why dupery is such a crucial element for Lacan, because it allows him to show you that the imaginary is not as simple as you think. To think with Lacan, in the thoughts he's asking us to enter into, you have to be a dupe. You have to pass through the imaginary. From Seminar 20 forward, he is resurrecting the imaginary as an absolute foundation for psychoanalytic theory and technique. Analysis in the clinic and at the level of the concept begins with the imaginary. Analysis begins with a name, a narrative, an ailment, some singular presentation, an image of the one. Here's why I'm here. And what Lacan is saying is that in order to start thinking with him in this period of his thought, you also have to show up in an imaginary state. Just look at the diagram on your screen. Do you really see a white circle there? Of course you don't. There are two strokes of the pen in white that make it appear as though there is a white circle underneath the blue. Wait a minute. This is a two-dimensional digital image on your screen. How is one underneath the other? Is that even possible with a digital image? You see, what is on your screen is an optical illusion, not too different from what the analysand shows up with as a narrative of what ails them. Lacan is saying that good analytic work in the clinic, but also at the level of the concept, begins by allowing yourself to be a dupe of an imaginary, allowing yourself to be duped by an optical illusion. That is what is on your screen right now. The Borromean knot matters as a drawing that produces an optical illusion into and subsequently out of which you then think. The same way that the analysand enters into an imaginary narrative in order to work themselves out of it at a later date. You see, analytic theory and technique have never been apart from Lacan, for Lacan. These two are right on top of each other. The trickiest one up here is the symbolic. And not just because I had to invent a word to help us call its whole-making function into some sort of assistance. But I do think that this is a wild one. And you wouldn't imagine it, right? Because Lacan, 1950s, all about the symbolic, you think it's pretty straightforward. Here, though, 20 years later, he's really cutting to what he thinks is the bone of the symbolic order. Its basic field and function amounts to the topology of a whole. It's about whole making and the structure of a whole. That's what we have to focus on. That is what absistence names. I think it's the trickiest one up here. So let's take a second, see if we can get our feet underneath us. To absist is to withdraw presence. This is fundamentally what it means to make a whole. To absist is to withdraw presence, leaving only absence in its place, an inner void, the structural logic of which is that of a whole. I write ab inside the purple ring on your screen to mark it as a whole, a place where presence has been withdrawn, where absence appears, if you will. In every circle Lacan is suggesting, there is a whole. And this structural logic of the circle is crucial. Wholes are always wholes in. They are figures of absence which appear in the midst of presence. When you are in the presence of a circle, there is a figure of absence which also shows up as such. Wholes are also as simple as the noticeable absence of that classmate of yours. You know the guy I'm talking about. You know the guy who always sits in the second seat of the lecture hall's third row? Yeah, except that one day. Do you remember that one day when that guy who usually sits in the second seat of the lecture hall's third row, remember that day he didn't show up? That one day when he didn't show up, leaving his usual seat empty. He may not have shown up that day, but his absence sure as hell did. That's why I tell you that the absence here is a noticeable one. When you expect to see someone in a certain place at a certain time, but they are not there, their absence becomes noticeable. It's a term from discourse analysis. Social scientists know this term very well. Noticeable absence is what we're talking about. When I say absistence, it's a noticeable whole. This is an absence that is noticeable, and as such made present. It is a one made of the zero resulting from its subtraction. It doesn't get more symbolic than that, at least for Lacan. 1 minus 1 equals 0. And 0 is a figure of absence whose presence allows us to count 1 again. I think there's an easy and a difficult way to understand what Lacan means when he insists again and again in this period that the proper function of the symbolic is to make a whole. Middle Lacan, which I mentioned a few moments ago, invites us down the easier path. The symbolic, he tells us, kills the thing, and the death of the thing results in the endless perpetuation of desire. Straight from the Function and the Field essay, Lacan's first great manifesto of psychoanalysis. We've been over it before. Check it out on your own. It's a great little piece, kind of a large piece to get into. When I have a name for the thing, I simply don't require the thing's presence as much as before. You see, we can talk about my dog Domino without her being here. But now, having said that, I experience her as lacking, and thus a cause of my desire. And when my dearly beloved dog Domino passes back into the earth from which that hellion sprang, and I bury her next to her sisters in Golden Gate Park, shh, don't tell anybody about my pet cemetery in Golden Gate Park. And when I leave a little domino for her tombstone, all I'm getting is a geolocation, so I know where and just how to continue missing her. Later Lacan, the Lacan of Seminar 23, he's got a similar idea as all of this about the symbolic and its hole making. Sorry, did I say grave digging? I meant hole making function. Lacan's not too far from this thought in the mid-1970s, but it's a little more complicated for him at this point. Name, symbolic. Language, symbolic. Signifier, symbolic. Call it what you will. All are figures of the symbolic, and they all share the same function. Name, symbol, language, they all make wholes. Each is ever cutting in, digging in, carving in and carving out. Each name, symbol, language, in other words, is a figure of absistence. Where precisely do we see this whole-making function at work? In the symbolic, to be sure, this hasn't changed. But also Lacan now tells us in the real. And this is what interests him in the mid-1970s. There is a symbolic effect in the real that causes the real to be holed out. And he just is popping with this idea that the symbolic can also make a hole in the real. You can see it at the start of Seminar 23. He's brimming with this thing. It starts at the bottom of page 21, I think. Oh, yeah. Bottom of 21. No, maybe like 2/3 of the way down. This is such a wild passage. This is a tough one to wrap our feet around. We got to do it. Page 21, Seminar 23. Language is tied to something that makes a hole in the real. Observational method cannot start off from language without accepting the fact that in what can be situated as real, language only emerges in making a whole. It is on the basis of this function of the whole that language effects its purchase on the real. It's not easy for me to impress upon you the full weight of this conviction. This is a conviction that to my eye is unavoidable, given that truth as such is only possible when the real is hollowed out. Moreover, language eats into the real. And then it continues the thought at the top of 22. Language is not in itself a message, but rather is only sustained by the function of what I've called the whole in the real. For this, there exists the path of our new most geometricus, our geometrical way. That is, the substance that results from the specific efficacy of language, and which is supported by the function of the whole. Whoa. The symbolic eats into the real. Language makes a hole in the real. What kind of a symbol makes a hole in the real? We discussed this a bunch in our last series, and I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, but Seminar 23 at this point feels a lot like Lacan just synthesizing a lot of the work he's already done at this point. And as such, work that we've already covered in previous series. So I'll just cut to the chase here. What allows language to make a hole in the real is the symptom. The symptom is the type of symbol that makes a hole in the real. In other words, at this point in Lacan's teaching, the symptom is no longer simply a signifier. More precisely, it is a signifying effect. The symptom is not simply a symbol. It is now a symbolic effect. A symbolic effect that, oddly enough, shows up beyond the symbolic in its exterior domain, an exterior domain whose existence we call real. The symptom, Lacan now tells us, is a symbolic effect in the real. There's the definition with which we begin. Not where we end that definition, but the definition with which we begin. This symptom that is a symbolic effect in the real. It is a symbolic effect in the real that in turn eats away at everything else. The symptom is a symbolic effect in the real that eats away at the real. The symbolic and the imaginary alike. And I would just add once more, in keeping with the only stray color on your screen right now, that the symptom as a symbolic effect in the real eats away at one thing more than any other: meaning. The symptom eats away at meaning. You can hear that in a lot of different ways. Plug it into a clinical context. Lacan is now telling us that the symptom is a symbolic effect in the real that eats away at every meaning in your life. Hence, the definition that we ultimately arrived at in our last series. The symptom is a symbolic effect in the real, commanded by the unconscious, that eats away at meaning. If you want one to put on a t-shirt, that's it. I'd love to see that t-shirt. You make that t-shirt, let me know. You get that tattooed and I'm going to be the first to see it. I got to see this thing. So, my friends, if the real is meaningless, I would like to suggest that the symptom is its revenge. Meaning be damned when the symptom shows up. Every domino, yours and mine alike, must fall. Another question. What the fuck is the symptom? Okay, if that's the symptom, what is this fourth term, the synthome, that Lacan wants to add to the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic? Note, that's why he calls it a fourth term. The synthome is a fourth term, he tells us at this point in Seminar 23, that he is adding to the other three, real, symbolic, and imaginary. What is the synthome at this point? Nothing is more uncertain in the opening lessons of Seminar 23. We do, however, find a clue at the end of Lesson 2. If I'm not mistaken, it's on page 30. Let me take a look. Ooh, yeah, this is great. Okay. Our first clue to the synthome on page 30 of Seminar 23. There can be no radical reduction of the fourth term, not even in analysis, because Freud stated, we don't know by which path, that there is an Urverdrängung, a repression that can never be undone. It is in the very nature of the symbolic to include this whole. This whole is what I am aiming at, and in it I recognize the Urverdrängung itself. Another key passage to bookmark at the start of Seminar 23. What's up with this fancy German term, Urverdrängung? What the hell does that mean? It is Freud's term for primary or primal repression, OG repression, if you want to call it such. And in Lacanian psychoanalysis, it points to what we call castration. Primary repression points to the operation, the logic. And by Seminar 19b, Lacan's very clear. It's a logic. Castration is not something somebody did to you. Castration is a logical and operational logic that occurs by the sheer fact that we are living individuals who speak, that speak. Urverdrängung, primal repression, connects to the Lacanian notion of castration as an operational logic. What is castration for Lacan? You probably know, but you're not the only one watching this video, so just hang on a second. Castration for Lacan is the original prohibition or constraint imposed on us by language. Well captured, for better and for worse, in the idea of the no of the Father. The nom du Père. I tend to read it now as the non-duped heir. Lacanian jokes, man. Not my thing. This no of the Father that typically indexes the Lacanian notion of castration, which effectively says, if you really need to personify this thing, thou shalt not go on living. This is my voice for some Moses figure with its thou shalt not. It's like the 11th commandment here. Thou shalt not go on living as though the symbolic doesn't exist. I like to begin it in like a Mosaic voice, but then I like to end in just my own voice. Thou shalt not go on living as though language isn't everywhere around you and precisely what we expect you to inhabit. That is castration. In other words, it's time to use your big boy words. Even when you refuse to use your big boy words, Lacan goes so far as to say in L'Étourdi, brilliant passages in that little essay, even when you refuse to use language, even when you naysay language, you have to do so using language. Castration means that it is impossible to say no to the symbolic, to say no to language, because in order to naysay anything, you have to make use of language. So the synthome, it would seem, is somehow caught up with the unconscious as an effect structure of primal repression, where an original symptom of castration exists beyond the symbolic, in the real, and yet as a whole in both, a whole whose absistence can never be undone, as you just heard Lacan put it. But I don't even know if we can say that. Even in so saying, I think we might be getting a bit ahead of ourselves here at the start of Seminar 23. We just don't know enough to say with any confidence what Lacan means by the synthome in the first few lessons of Seminar 23. Not yet. So let's keep this simple, or at least simpler, and focus on the whole-making logic of the symbolic with which we have been working, especially as it relates to the opening figure of Seminar 23 with which we have also been working, namely the body. Here, at least, with the whole-making logic of the symbolic as it relates to the figure of the body, here at least we have a toehold. If the experience of having a body is one of imaginary consistence, and that of being a body is one of real existence, what precisely does it mean to think or theorize a body in terms of symbolic absistence? That is the question before us. A clue, I would suggest, comes to us in the passage we read from Lacan's MIT talk. More than a sphere, you'll recall him saying, the body is a bag of skin. And this is where things get interesting. The body may appear to be a sphere, but in fact, it's just a bag of skin. Not a sphere, but a sack. This is how Lacan invites us to theorize the human body. So, what does it mean to think or theorize the body in terms of symbolic absistence, it means to think or theorize the body as a sack, as a bag, particularly one made of skin. The body is a sack of skin. Interestingly, you also see this at the start of Seminar 23. It's really one of the first moves that Lacan makes in Seminar 23. It starts on page 9 and continues up through page 10, and you may have experienced this as the first real speed bump in your reading of Seminar 23. I sure did. Take a close look, though, at the passages that I'm about to read. We start at the bottom of page 9 and continue to the top of page 10. Because of form, the form that was so dear to Plato, the individual presents himself just as he has been put together, as a body. And this body possesses such a power of captivation that up to a certain point, one should be envious of the blind. Wow. Because they wouldn't be so captive to what? To the image of one's body, to the specular image of one's body. That's the form in question here. It's a body that appears to be put together, seems to have a united form, and which we find captivating. So captivating that we should be envious of the blind, because they themselves, the image suggests, would not be so readily captivated by the image of one's own body. You see? You see how he's just rehearsing what he's saying? The astonishing thing, Lacan continues, is that form offers up nothing more than the bag, or, if you like, the bubble, because it's something that inflates. Now, don't get me started on bubbles again. You heard me talking about bubbles in our series on Seminar 11, on the drive. Some of you know also that I got really into bubbles at that point. Respiratory functions. This is years ago. The respiratory drive, I think, is still the fundamental drive in Lacanian psychoanalysis. We can go over all that. My kid still chews gum and she blows bubbles all the time, and I'm just fascinated by this stuff. Inspirare, to breathe into. Anyway, I taught a whole class on bubbles, featuring the work of a guy who I don't really like, but whose thought impresses me, Peter Sloterdijk. His early work in the 80s on the Greek kinetics, brilliant. But he's got this 3-volume series on spheres, as it were, the first of which he considers is the bubble for intimacy. Lacan is working something similar here, and rest assured, Sloterdijk is indebted to Lacan. This may even be one of the passages that gets his spherology going. Bubbles. The body, first and foremost, is a bag, or if you like, a bubble, because it's something that inflates. Inspirare, breathing in, to inflate the way you would inflate a bubble. We're not going to push too hard on this. This is all I'm going to say about it, because it's the image of the bag that Lacan goes with, not the bubble. At least at this point in Seminar 23. What exactly are we working at here? Lacan immediately shifts to the obsessional. And then he's back to this notion of the bag. The bag, he starts at the top of page 10. And then he's into set theory. And then he's into the empty set. He says this bag does not form the unity of one, but it indicates that it is an empty bag, since it is able to contain nothing. And this is the real clue. What does it mean to think or theorize the human body in terms of symbolic absistence, in terms of whole making, the structural logic of a whole? Our first clue comes from Lacan inviting us to conceptualize the body as a bag, particularly an empty bag, a bag which is able to contain nothing. I hope that helps smooth the speed bump of pages 9 to 10 of Seminar 23 just a bit. It certainly gives us a little bit of focus and allows us to really pursue the inquiry at hand, which goes like this. What exactly does psychoanalytic thought discover in this bag of skin? Well, something to talk about for sure, but also, more fundamentally, nothing to discuss. What intrigues Lacan about the body as a sack of skin is its emptiness. The fact that this sack contains nothing. Hence, his return to the empty set in the same passage we just read. I'll let you sort that out. It's not as complicated as he makes it sound. And it's certainly not as complicated as Miller makes it sound in his overwrought commentary at the end. At stake in this bag, this empty bag, which is able to contain nothing that is the human body when theorized from a Lacanian vantage point. At stake here is not a body without organs, but a body whose bag-like structure allows it to remain empty, or at least, and I think this is the crucial part, a body whose bag-like structure allows for some of its contents to remain so far down inside that these contents cannot be recovered, much less interpreted. Does this sound familiar? You bet it does. Lacan is once more talking about the unconscious. But not the part of the unconscious that can be said and known in analysis. It's the part of unconscious truth that cannot be said or known, whose passage into the field of enunciated knowledge remains blocked. That is what interests Lacan here about the unconscious. Hence, once more, we begin to approach the symptom, and in much the same way if you think about it. The symptom, the symptom, the symptom. Lots of ways to hear and read this one. The symptom is a primal symptom fused to unknowable unconscious truth that cannot be captured in language or subjected to analysis. Again, recall the introduction to Seminar 23, which is Lacan's MIT talk. I quote from page 10 to 11 of the version available at Freud to Lacan. I think you're going to like this. Symptom and unconscious. An endless screw, round. And one never succeeds in unwinding it all. Verdrängen. There is a hole. This is because there is a knot and some real that remains at the bottom. Are you, my friend, as a bag of skin, empty? No, though it often feels, and sometimes even appears, that way. Is this because your essential content, a primordial knot of repression, remains hidden somewhere at the bottom? Maybe. And tied to the real? Perhaps. But in pursuing this inquiry, I think we also beg another. What do you see at the bottom of the bag of skin that you are? What appears down there at the bottom of this empty sack? A hole. Beneath the endless screw of symptom and unconscious, which we never succeed in removing, there is a hole that remains deep down in the bag which you are. Me as well. Would you say that it's a butthole? Is it a butthole that remains deep down in the bag of skin, which you and I both are. You bet it is. But we spell but with one T, not two. The butthole at the bottom of the bag of skin that you and I both are is spelled B-U-T-H-O-L-E. The knot in something real that remains deep down and only ever appears as a hole is akin to the opening, gap, or crack indexed by the but in my phrase, some, but not all. Call it irremediable division. Call it a non-rapport. What it amounts to, structurally speaking, is a whole. So let's be categorical. If the living individual is a bag of skin, the speaking being that primal repression, Verdrängung, makes of this living individual is a bag of skin with a hole in it. Whether we're talking about a hole in the real effected by language or a hole in meaning effected by the real, or something else entirely, all of this remains to be seen. It's still too soon in Seminar 23 to say. But it is to this question, and several more, that we now turn.